The first account comes from a supply rider who arrived just after sunrise. His name appears only once in the county ledger, written in narrow ink beside a delivery receipt dated April 3, 1871. According to the brief note he left with the clerk in town, he reached the plantation expecting the usual morning activity: field hands already moving through the rows, smoke rising from the cookhouse, someone shouting instructions across the yard. Instead, the road was quiet. The plantation itself sat on a broad clearing several miles from the nearest settlement. Two long rows of cabins faced a central yard. Beyond them were the barns, the smokehouse, and the main residence. On most mornings, the place produced a low, constant sound: tools striking wood, wagon wheels shifting in dirt, voices calling from one building to another. That morning, there was none of it. The rider dismounted at the gate and waited for someone to approach. When no one did, he walked in. The first thing he noticed was the door to the cookhouse. It stood open. A pot rested over cold coals. Inside, a table had been laid for breakfast. Bread had been sliced. Plates were arranged in a row as if people had only stepped outside for a moment. He called out once. No one answered. Before we go further, a brief note for viewers who value careful, documented storytelling. If you appreciate this kind of reconstruction, stories built from records rather than rumor, you may consider subscribing. It helps this channel continue examining events that are often remembered only in fragments. The rider continued across the yard. The cabins were unlocked. Some beds had been slept in. Others had blankets folded in the simple way laborers often left them before the day's work began. A lantern still hung from a hook in one doorway. The oil had burned out sometime during the night. He checked the barn next. 2 wagons remained inside. The horses were gone. That detail appears several times in later statements. Whoever left the plantation took the animals with them. Not just 1 or 2, but every working horse. The stalls were empty, the gates unlatched. At first, the rider assumed the workers had already moved out to the fields. The plantation stretched across several hundred acres, and from the central yard you could not see most of the cultivated land. He walked to the edge of the clearing and waited. Still nothing. No voices, no tools, no movement in the rows. By mid-morning, he returned to town and reported the situation to the county office. The clerk who recorded his statement did not initially treat the event as unusual. Plantations were large operations. People moved between fields, barns, and supply roads throughout the day. But by the afternoon, another rider confirmed the same observation. The plantation was empty. 200 people were believed to live and work there at the time: laborers, cooks, drivers, stable hands, and the family that owned the property. Yet by every early account, not a single person remained. Meals had been prepared, doors were open, personal belongings had been left where they were normally kept. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken furniture, no damaged buildings, just absence.
Over the next several days, the county sheriff organized a search. At first, the investigation focused on nearby roads. The assumption was that the workers had relocated, perhaps temporarily, to another plantation after a dispute with the owner. But the surrounding properties reported nothing unusual. No large group had arrived. No wagons had passed during the night. It was during the 3rd day of the search that one of the deputies followed a narrow trail leading from the rear of the plantation toward the forest. The path was not used often. It cut between old cypress stands and eventually disappeared into thicker woodland. About half a mile in, the deputy noticed something in the soil. Tracks. At first, he believed they belonged to a wagon convoy, but after walking farther, he realized the marks were not wheels. They were footprints. Hundreds of them. The ground had been soft from recent rain, preserving impressions with unusual clarity. Men's boots, smaller shoes, bare feet. The shapes overlapped in places where the group had passed together. All of them pointed in the same direction, deeper into the forest. The deputy followed the trail for nearly an hour before the path became harder to read. The soil turned rocky, leaves covered the ground. Eventually, the tracks faded entirely. What troubled him was not the direction, it was the pattern. Because nowhere along that path, at least not within the distance he searched, did he find a single footprint facing the other way. The deputy returned before sunset and reported what he had seen to the sheriff. His written note was brief. It described a wide set of tracks beginning near the back of the plantation and continuing into forest land that was rarely traveled. What he could not explain was the order of the movement. The impressions suggested a large group walking together, not a scattered crowd or people moving at different times. The sheriff visited the location the following morning. He brought 2 additional deputies and a surveyor from town, a man who occasionally assisted with property disputes and boundary mapping. Their task was simple: follow the route as far as the land allowed and determine whether the tracks eventually turned back toward any road or settlement. The plantation owner's house had been searched the night before. Documents remained in place. Clothing hung in wardrobes. Several locked chests contained account books dating back years. Nothing indicated that the owner or his family had planned to leave. The surveyor made careful notes as the group reached the start of the trail. He measured the width of the track pattern where the ground still held moisture. At certain points, the impressions spread across nearly the entire path, suggesting that dozens of people had moved side by side rather than in a narrow line. The sheriff found that detail unusual. Most groups traveling through wooded terrain naturally form a single path. Here, the opposite seemed to have happened. The footprints spread outward, filling open ground whenever the trees allowed it. They continued walking. The forest in that region was not especially dense, but it was old. Cypress roots pushed through the soil in long ridges. Moss covered fallen trunks. A person unfamiliar with the area could lose direction quickly without a clear landmark. Yet the tracks never wandered. Every set pointed forward. The surveyor eventually counted several distinct shoe sizes. Some prints were heavy, likely from men used to field labor. Others were smaller and lighter. A few bare footprints appeared between them, the kind often left by children who moved between cabins during the day. By midday, they reached the place where the deputy had lost the trail. The rain from earlier in the week had softened the earth in patches, but left other sections dry. Once the ground turned rocky, the impressions became irregular and finally disappeared under layers of leaf litter. The sheriff ordered the group to spread out. They searched the surrounding forest for any continuation: broken branches, disturbed soil, discarded objects. A large group moving through unfamiliar terrain often leaves secondary signs, even when footprints vanish. For several hours, they found almost nothing. Near a shallow creek, one of the deputies noticed a small scrap of cloth caught on a branch. It matched the rough fabric commonly worn by field hands working in the region. The tear looked recent. But beyond that point, the forest gave no further evidence. The surveyor later wrote that the most unsettling aspect of the search was not the disappearance itself, but the absence of hesitation in the tracks. The steps maintained a consistent pace. No sudden scatter, no signs of people turning around or breaking away. It appeared that the entire group had walked into the forest together with a shared direction in mind. In the days that followed, the county office began collecting statements from anyone who had regular contact with the plantation. Traders, mule drivers, timber workers, and travelers who used the outer road were asked to recall the previous week in detail. Most of the responses were unremarkable. Several people remembered routine deliveries.
Others mentioned seeing smoke from the cookhouse chimneys as usual. Nothing suggested sudden conflict or preparation for departure. One merchant from the nearby settlement did remember a conversation with the plantation owner 2 evenings before the disappearance. The meeting took place beside a wagon loaded with seed sacks. According to the merchant's recollection, the owner spoke about labor shortages spreading across the county. Farms to the south had recently lost workers who left without formal notice. The merchant described the owner as irritated but not alarmed. At the time, it sounded like a common complaint. Another statement came from a carpenter who had repaired part of the main barn earlier that week. He described the workers on the property as quiet but organized. Meals were served at predictable hours. Field crews moved in coordinated groups. He recalled no visible disputes. The sheriff noted these accounts carefully because they contradicted a simple explanation. Large groups rarely vanish without some sign of preparation. Wagons are packed, supplies disappear, animals are gathered early. Someone in the surrounding area usually sees movement. In this case, none of those signs appeared in the records. The plantation's storage rooms still held tools. Food remained in barrels and sacks. Even small personal items, pipes, knives, clothing, had been left behind in the cabins. One detail drew particular attention. The stable ledger listed 12 horses assigned to hauling work between fields and nearby roads. When deputies first inspected the barn, all 12 were gone. The saddles used for riding remained hanging from wooden pegs. That suggested the animals had been led rather than ridden. The sheriff later commented in a letter to the county judge that this choice implied discipline. Moving a large group through forest terrain is easier when animals carry supplies rather than riders. But the plantation had not stored enough equipment to support a long journey. If the workers had intended to travel far, they would have needed provisions. No such preparations were found. During the second week of the investigation, the search expanded beyond the initial trail trace. Deputies rode outward along several old logging routes that connected to distant settlements. They checked river crossings and ferry points, where a group that size might have passed. Every inquiry returned the same answer. No one had seen them. The absence of witnesses slowly shifted the tone of the investigation. Early discussions had focused on where the group might have gone. By the end of the second week, the question had begun to change. Officials started asking whether the entire population of the plantation had left willingly. The sheriff's notebooks contained several pages of observations about group behavior in isolated labor communities. He had handled disputes before, conflicts over wages, rations, or punishment. In most cases, disagreements produced visible divisions. Workers argued. Some stayed while others left. What troubled him in this situation was the unity suggested by the trail. Every footprint pointed the same direction. No scattered paths, no sign of anyone turning back. It suggested agreement. And agreement in a place structured by strict authority usually formed only under unusual pressure. During the third week of the inquiry, attention shifted from the forest to the structure of the plantation itself. County officials began examining payroll records, supply logs, and correspondence recovered from the main residence. These documents offered a clearer picture of how the property had been managed in the months leading up to the disappearance. The plantation had expanded rapidly during the late 1860s. Cotton prices had risen, and the owner, identified in property filings as Elias Cartwright, had invested heavily in additional acreage. Several neighboring plots were purchased and cleared within a short period. To maintain the larger fields, Cartwright hired labor crews through intermediaries who recruited workers from nearby counties. The arrangement followed a system becoming common across parts of the region. Workers were promised housing, wages at the end of each season, and basic supplies drawn from the plantation store.
In theory, the system created stability for both sides. In practice, it often produced dependency. Receipts from the plantation store show that most workers relied on credit for everyday goods. Food staples, clothing, and tools were deducted from future wages. The ledger entries were precise but dense, making it difficult for anyone without formal education to track the balance. One of the deputies assigned to review the records later remarked that nearly every name in the book carried a line of debt. The amounts varied. Some workers owed only small sums for boots or blankets. Others appeared to owe several months of wages in advance purchases. Whether these calculations were accurate could not be determined easily. The accounts were written entirely in the owner's hand. The sheriff visited the plantation again to speak with individuals who might have known more about daily conditions. 2 overseers had lived on the property but were absent during the disappearance. One had traveled to a distant town to negotiate equipment purchases. The other had been sent north with a wagon shipment of cotton. Both men were located and questioned. Their descriptions of life on the plantation were consistent. Workdays began before sunrise and ended near dusk. Crews were divided by task: field labor, animal care, maintenance, and kitchen work. Discipline was firm, but according to their statements, not unusual for agricultural operations of that scale. Neither man claimed to know of any organized dispute. Yet one remark made by the traveling overseer drew the sheriff's interest. Several weeks before the disappearance, a small group of workers had approached him with questions about their account balances. They wanted to understand how much they would actually receive when the harvest season ended. The overseer told them that such matters were handled directly by Cartwright and advised them to speak with the owner. Whether that conversation took place remains unclear. No written complaint appears in the surviving documents, but the sheriff noted something in the margins of his report. When labor communities begin discussing debt collectively, the conversation rarely remains private. Ideas spread quickly in close quarters, and once a group begins comparing what they owe and what they expect to earn, the numbers can carry unexpected consequences. By the 4th week, the investigation had slowed. Search parties still moved through the outer forest in widening circles, but the results remained unchanged. No campsite was discovered. No abandoned wagons appeared along the logging roads. River ferries reported no unusual crossings. The disappearance remained confined to a narrow stretch of land between the plantation yard and the wooded trail. With little new physical evidence, the sheriff began focusing more closely on the relationships within the plantation itself. He spent several days reviewing the store ledger again, this time comparing dates rather than balances. Purchases tended to cluster around pay periods and harvest shipments. Yet during the final 2 months recorded in the book, the pattern shifted. Workers had begun buying less from the store. Certain items, especially preserved food and dried corn, appeared in smaller quantities than usual. That change suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either supplies had been coming from another source, or people had begun conserving what they had. Neither explanation fit easily with the owner's accounting notes, which still projected normal deductions from wages at the end of the season. The sheriff also examined the housing arrangement across the cabin rows. Most of the dwellings held several occupants. Families lived together in some cases, while in others groups of laborers shared a single space. Conversations in those buildings would have been constant. News moved quickly from one door to another. When people began asking questions about debt, the subject likely reached every cabin within days. A letter discovered in the desk of the main house offered a small clue about how Cartwright had responded to similar concerns in the past. The letter was addressed to a neighboring landowner and discussed difficulties maintaining labor discipline after the war years. Cartwright wrote that many workers had grown accustomed to questioning arrangements that had once been accepted without debate. The phrasing was formal, but the meaning was clear.
He believed the system should continue largely unchanged. Whether he expressed this opinion directly to the workers is unknown. No written statement from them survives. But the sheriff later suggested that if a conversation about wages had taken place, it may not have ended with agreement. Late in the week, one of the deputies returned from a nearby county with a statement from a traveling preacher who had passed through the area shortly before the disappearance. The preacher had spent a single evening near the Plantation Road, offering sermons to anyone willing to gather after work. His memory of the crowd was limited, yet he recalled a discussion that lasted longer than the service itself. Several laborers had asked him questions about contracts, fairness, and obligations between employer and worker. The preacher answered cautiously. He told them that written agreements were meant to protect both sides, though he admitted that many people signing such papers never saw the final accounting. The sheriff underlined that line in his notes. A community that begins examining the structure governing it often reaches a moment where silence becomes difficult. Once people compare experiences, uncertainty can transform into something more organized. If that process had begun on the plantation, it would explain the unusual unity suggested by the trail. Large groups rarely move together unless they believe the decision affects everyone equally. By early May, the investigation began drawing attention from outside the county. Reports of the empty plantations circulated through regional newspapers, though most articles repeated only the basic facts. An agricultural property abandoned without notice, a trail of footprints leading into woodland, and no confirmed sightings afterward. The county judge requested a more formal review of the plantation's management records. 2 clerks were assigned to reconstruct the financial structure that had governed the labor contracts. They worked through several boxes of documents recovered from the main house, agreements, payment schedules, and correspondence with merchants who supplied tools and food. The contracts followed a pattern common during the Reconstruction period. Workers were hired at the beginning of a season under an arrangement promising wages after harvest. Until that time, daily necessities were drawn from the plantation store. Each purchase was recorded as an advance against future earnings. On paper, the arrangement appeared orderly. In practice, the calculations were complicated. Prices for goods varied month to month. Interest charges were sometimes added when balances remained unpaid. Workers rarely saw the full ledger, and many depended on the owner's final summary to determine what they were owed. When the clerks compared individual accounts, they noticed something unusual. Several names had been marked with adjustments written in darker ink than the original entries. These corrections appeared during the final weeks before the disappearance. Some balances increased without explanation. Others showed erased numbers replaced by larger amounts. The handwriting belonged to Cartwright. The clerks could not determine whether the revisions were legitimate bookkeeping corrections or something else. The records offered no supporting notes. The sheriff considered the possibility that workers had discovered the changes themselves. In a close community, it would not take long for someone assigned to the store to notice discrepancies.
A single conversation could spread quickly. One of the surviving overseers provided additional context during a second interview. He recalled that a man named Thomas Bell had recently been assisting with supply deliveries from the storehouse to the cabins. Bell had basic reading skills and occasionally helped others understand the entries attached to their purchases. Bell's name appeared frequently in the ledger. His balance had been adjusted twice during the final week recorded. No explanation accompanied the revisions. The sheriff noted that individuals capable of interpreting written accounts often became informal leaders within labor communities. People naturally turned to them when confusion arose over numbers or agreements. If Bell had begun questioning the entries, others might have followed his reasoning. Yet the records contained no direct reference to a dispute. The overseers insisted that daily work continued without interruption until the evening before the disappearance. What remained difficult to explain was the coordinated nature of the departure.
For 200 people to leave together, a decision would have needed to circulate quietly through the entire settlement. Not a rumor, not a sudden impulse, something closer to agreement. And agreements among large groups tend to form gradually, often in places where formal authority does not reach. Shared meals, quiet conversations after work, or discussions inside the cabins once the lanterns were lit. Those moments rarely appear in official documents, but they can shape the direction of events long before anyone outside the community notices a change. In late May, the county judge authorized a second examination of the plantation grounds, this time focusing less on the forest trail and more on the physical layout of the settlement. The purpose was to understand how information might have moved among the residents during the days before they left. 2 clerks and the sheriff spent several afternoons walking the property slowly, mapping distances between buildings. The cabins formed 2 facing rows along the central yard. Between them ran a narrow open space where people passed constantly throughout the day. Children moving between families, workers returning from the fields, cooks carrying supplies from the storehouse. From one doorway, a person could easily see several others. It was a design that encouraged observation. The clerks noticed that most cabins were close enough for conversations to carry through open windows. At night, when lantern lights spread through the yard, anyone standing outside could see silhouettes moving inside neighboring rooms. In other words, privacy was limited. The sheriff concluded that if discussions about the accounts had begun inside one building, they would have reached others quickly. The settlement was arranged in a way that allowed ideas to travel without formal meetings. He also studied the placement of the storehouse. It stood near the entrance road, slightly apart from the cabins. Workers passed it daily when collecting tools or supplies. According to the records, Thomas Bell had helped distribute goods from this building during the final month before the disappearance. If Bell had noticed irregularities in the ledger, that location would have given him regular contact with nearly every laborer on the property. One of the clerks suggested that the conversations may have begun informally. A worker receiving supplies might have asked a simple question about an entry beside his name. Bell, attempting to clarify the numbers, might have compared one account with another. Numbers have a way of revealing patterns when placed side by side. The sheriff considered how such a realization might spread. A person discovering that his balance was larger than expected would likely share the information with others in his cabin. Those neighbors might check their own accounts the next time they visited the storehouse. Gradually, the comparisons would accumulate. The plantation's structure offered many opportunities for quiet exchanges, water wells, shared meals, evenings when work ended and people gathered near the cabins. None of those moments would appear in official records, yet they formed the social center of the community. During one of these visits, the sheriff entered the storehouse again. He examined the shelves where supplies had been kept. Several crates of dried food remained unopened. Tools hung neatly on pegs. Nothing suggested that large quantities had been taken in preparation for a long journey. That detail continued to trouble him. If the workers had decided to leave together, they had done so without gathering the resources normally required for travel. The horses taken from the barn might carry people for a time, but food and equipment would eventually become necessary. The sheriff wrote in his notebook that this absence implied urgency rather than planning. Something had likely occurred that made delay impossible. The decision to depart may have formed over weeks of quiet discussion, but the moment when the group finally acted, when 200 people stepped away from the cabins and followed the trail into the forest, probably came much faster. As the investigation entered its second month, the search parties gradually reduced their activity. The forest had been examined repeatedly without uncovering any new direction of travel. Attention returned to the documents recovered from the plantation house, where a different kind of evidence began to emerge. Among Cartwright's correspondence was a packet of letters exchanged with a cotton broker in Galveston. Most discussed shipping schedules and expected yields, but one letter written shortly before the disappearance carried a different tone. In it, Cartwright described growing difficulty maintaining predictable labor commitments under the current system. He expressed concern that workers had become increasingly aware of the calculations governing their contracts. The phrase was precise. It suggested that the conversations the sheriff suspected had indeed reached the owner. The letter went on to propose an adjustment. Cartwright planned to revise several outstanding balances before the harvest was complete. According to his explanation, doing so would restore order to the accounts and discourage further agitation. The wording did not clarify how the adjustments would be presented to the workers themselves. The county clerks compared the date of that letter with the darker ink entries in the ledger. The revisions appeared within days of the correspondence. Several accounts that had previously shown small debts were suddenly expanded. From a bookkeeping perspective, the changes could be explained as corrections, but from the point of view of the laborers, the effect would have been different.
A person expecting a modest payment at the end of the season might discover that his earnings had effectively disappeared. Such discoveries rarely remain private. The sheriff considered how that information might have been received. Workers already discussing their balances would have compared the new figures immediately. The presence of someone like Bell, capable of reading the entries clearly, would make those comparisons easier. If multiple people found their accounts suddenly altered, the conclusion might appear obvious. The system governing them had shifted. Late in June, another statement arrived from a man who had traveled the outer road on the night before the plantation was found empty. He had been moving timber with a small wagon and remembered hearing distant voices coming from the direction of the cabins. The sound was unusual only because it continued long after dark. He assumed the workers were holding a meeting or gathering of some kind. The man did not approach the settlement. He continued down the road and camped several miles away. The sheriff read the statement several times. Large discussions after sunset were uncommon on plantations organized around strict daily schedules. People normally rested once work ended. Extended conversations suggested that something important was being decided. What remained unclear was the result of that conversation. The footprints in the forest indicated that the entire population eventually moved in the same direction, yet the documents implied tension between the workers and the owner. The sheriff began to consider a possibility that had not appeared in earlier reports. The departure might not have been a simple escape. It could have been a response to a decision made inside the plantation itself. By midsummer, the sheriff began reconstructing the final evening on the plantation as carefully as the records allowed. The statement from the timber hauler placed voices in the settlement well after sunset. The normal morning meal had been prepared in advance. Together, these details hinted at a gathering that extended late into the night and carried directly into the early hours. The sheriff believed the conversation likely involved more than a small group. The cabins were close together, and news moved quickly across the yard. If Bell or others had presented the revised account balances to their neighbors, the numbers would have spread from door to door. Within a short time, nearly everyone living on the property would have understood the same calculation. For many, the conclusion may have been unsettling. Months of work that had been expected to produce wages instead might result in additional debt. The sheriff imagined how that realization might have affected the mood of the settlement. People who had tolerated the system while expecting payment might reconsider their position once those expectations changed. Yet a large group facing that discovery would still need to decide what action to take. Leaving quietly required agreement from nearly every household. Families would need to gather children, move in darkness, and trust that the others were prepared to follow the same plan. The sheriff suspected that the horses played an important role in that decision. Taking the animals ensured that no immediate pursuit could begin at sunrise. Without them, the plantation owner would have difficulty organizing a search. But another question remained unresolved. Cartwright himself was among those missing. His personal belongings were still inside the residence. The desk contained unfinished letters. A coat hung near the doorway as if it had been removed at the end of the day. Nothing indicated that he had left voluntarily. The sheriff considered several possibilities. The owner might have joined the gathering and attempted to negotiate with the workers. He might have believed that discussion could resolve the dispute over the accounts. If that happened, the conversation could have taken an unexpected direction. Groups confronting authority sometimes reach a moment where the balance of power changes quickly. A single meeting can transform a private complaint into a collective demand. Yet, the sheriff found no evidence of violence in the yard or the buildings. Furniture remained intact. Windows were unbroken. The ground around the cabins showed no disturbance beyond the normal movement of many people. Whatever occurred during that night did not produce the visible chaos often associated with confrontation. Instead, the signs suggested something more controlled. People prepared food. They gathered, and at some point before dawn, the entire population moved toward the forest trail together. The sheriff wrote in his report that such coordination rarely emerges from panic. It usually follows a decision reached through discussion, even if that discussion takes place under pressure. What remained uncertain was whether Cartwright left the plantation by choice, or whether the group expected him to walk the same path they had chosen. Several months after the plantation was discovered empty, the county judge requested a final consolidation of the evidence. By that time, most of the active search efforts had ended. No additional tracks had been found beyond the point where the forest trail disappeared, and no settlement in the surrounding counties reported receiving a large traveling group. The sheriff prepared a written reconstruction based on the available material. His report began not with the night of the disappearance, but with the financial adjustments recorded in the plantation ledger. In his view, those revisions represented the first moment when the stability of the community may have shifted. Workers who believed their accounts were nearing balance might suddenly find themselves deeper in debt than before. If that realization spread widely enough, it could alter how the entire labor force viewed the coming harvest. The sheriff believed the discussions likely moved through the cabins during the final week. Bell or others who understood the entries may have compared the revised balances openly. Each conversation would add another voice to the same conclusion. By the evening before the departure, a gathering seems to have taken place. The timber hauler's statement suggested extended discussion long after the workday had ended. The sheriff speculated that the workers used this time to decide whether they would remain under the existing arrangement. Leaving the plantation carried serious risks. The surrounding forest was difficult terrain. Travel without preparation could expose families to hunger and illness. Yet remaining meant accepting the accounting system that governed their wages. The group faced a calculation of its own. At some point during that meeting, the sheriff believed a consensus emerged. The decision was not recorded in writing, but the evidence of the following morning pointed to collective action. Food had been prepared early, possibly for the journey ahead. Horses were taken from the barn to carry supplies or assist those unable to walk long distances.
Cartwright's presence during the meeting remained uncertain. The sheriff's report suggested two possible explanations. The owner may have attended the gathering and refused the workers' demands. If so, the discussion could have reached a point where the community insisted on leaving together rather than negotiating further. The second possibility was quieter. Cartwright might have been told that the workers intended to depart regardless of his position. In that case, he may have joined the movement simply because remaining alone on the property offered little advantage. Neither explanation could be proven. What remained clear was the order reflected in the footprints. The trail indicated that the group moved steadily through the forest rather than scattering in different directions. Families walked alongside laborers. Children's steps appeared between larger tracks. It looked less like flight and more like relocation. The sheriff closed the report with a short observation. Communities organized around strict authority often appear stable from the outside. But stability built on disputed agreements can shift quickly once those agreements are questioned openly. When that moment arrives, decisions that once seemed impossible may suddenly become practical. And when enough people reach the same conclusion at the same time, an entire settlement can disappear before anyone outside the community understands why. After the sheriff's report was filed, the county closed the formal investigation. The plantation remained under Cartwright's legal ownership, but without its population, the property quickly lost its function. Fields that had once been cultivated were left unattended through the remainder of the season. By the following year, neighboring farmers described the land as partially reclaimed by weeds and tall grass. The absence of the workers created an unusual problem for the local administration. In many labor disputes, people eventually appeared elsewhere, on another farm, along a river port, or in the growing towns further west. Movements of that scale were rarely invisible.
Yet months passed without a confirmed trace of the group. Several rumors circulated during that time. One claimed that a large community had settled deep beyond the forest, building temporary camps where the land opened into marshland. Another suggested that the group had divided after reaching a distant road and traveled in smaller parties to avoid attention. None of these accounts could be verified. The sheriff occasionally received letters from other counties asking whether the missing laborers had been identified elsewhere. His replies were brief. Without names or individual descriptions, it was nearly impossible to match people to the records kept on the plantation. Many of the workers had been listed in the ledger only by first name. That detail reflected the system under which they had been hired. Labor intermediaries often recorded minimal information, focusing on the number of hands available rather than personal histories. Once the workers left the property, those incomplete records offered little help in tracing them. The forest trail remained the only physical clue. A surveyor returned to the area nearly a year later while mapping property boundaries for an unrelated dispute. He reported that the section of ground where the footprints had once been visible no longer held any clear impressions. Seasonal rain and new growth had altered the surface completely. The path itself still existed, though it appeared narrower than before. Travel through that forest left few lasting marks. Over time, the plantation's story shifted from investigation to local memory. People in nearby towns began referring to it simply as the silent place. Travelers occasionally rode past the empty yard and remarked on the abandoned buildings. But without new evidence, the details gradually faded from conversation. One element remained consistent in every retelling. No witness ever reported seeing the group return. The sheriff kept the final report in the county archive alongside property records and legal filings. Years later, when a clerk reviewed the documents during routine cataloging, he noted the unusual nature of the case. 200 residents had lived together under one system of labor and authority. At some point, they appear to have reached a shared conclusion about that system. And once that conclusion formed, they acted with remarkable unity. The archive preserved the ledgers, letters, and statements that described the conditions leading up to that decision. But the moment when the community chose its direction, when the first step toward the forest was taken, remained unrecorded. Years later, when historians began examining labor systems that emerged across the southern states after the war, the Cartwright Plantation occasionally appeared in footnotes and local records. The story was rarely discussed in detail, but the surviving documents offered a rare snapshot of a community at a turning point. Most plantations of the period produced extensive records of harvests, shipments, and ownership transfers. Far fewer preserved clear evidence of how the laborers themselves responded to the systems governing their work. The ledgers from Cartwright's property, along with the sheriff's report, revealed something unusual, a community that seems to have reached a shared understanding about the structure surrounding it. The financial adjustments written into the accounts may have been routine corrections from the owner's perspective. In bookkeeping language, numbers change frequently as goods are purchased and debts accumulate. But inside a settlement where workers already suspected that the calculations were difficult to verify, those changes could take on a different meaning. Once people began comparing entries, the situation would become difficult to contain. Each account represented a promise about the future. When those promises appeared unstable, the agreement between employer and worker could quickly lose its authority. What happened during the final evening remains undocumented. The records do not preserve the voices of the people who gathered that night. There are no transcripts of their conversation, no written declaration explaining what they decided. Yet the physical evidence suggests a remarkable outcome. Families prepared to move before dawn. Horses were taken quietly from the barn. Meals were arranged in advance. When the first light reached the clearing, the entire population left the cabins and followed the same route toward the forest. No visible struggle remained behind them. No scattered directions divided the group. 200 individuals walked away from a system that had organized their lives, and they did so together. For historians, the event is difficult to classify. It does not resemble a traditional strike because no demands were formally delivered. It is not a simple migration either, since the destination was never recorded. What remains is a moment of collective action preserved almost entirely through absence. The plantation eventually passed into new ownership. Later records show that the buildings were repaired and the fields cultivated again with different workers. But the original residents of that settlement were never clearly traced in any official document. Their footprints faded from the forest within a season. What remains today are ledgers, letters, and a narrow path that once carried an entire community out of view. If you appreciate carefully reconstructed historical stories like this one, you can explore the other investigations here on Canon of Darkness. And if you would like to see more documented events uncovered piece by piece, consider subscribing.